Our resource list component is now working pretty well. Now, I want you to think back to something that I mentioned much earlier in this series of videos around hooks. Remember that I had told you that at first glance, it was going to seem like hooks just give our function-based components access to features that were traditionally available only inside of class-based components. And remember, I had said very specifically, that's what it's going to look like at first glance. But the real reason that we use hooks is because it makes it really easy to share logic between different components. So in this video, I want to show you how we can very easily reuse hook-related logic between different functional components. So to get started, I want to take a look at our resource list component. And I want to kind of break this thing down into separate chunks of code or separate statements. In particular, I want you to look at everything from useState down to the closing parenthesis of useEffect. When you look at all this code right here, you're going to see a ton of different variables floating around. But there's two important things I want to point out. First off, the only input to this chunk of code that is required to get it working correctly is that resource prop. That is the only input to all this code right here. Secondly, the only output from all this code, the only thing that we use inside of here somewhere else inside this component, is the list of resources that we fetched. So we essentially right now have something like this. We've got some input of resource that goes into all of our hook-related stuff, and then the only output is that resources array. So here's my question. My question is, can we somehow extract all that hook-related stuff into a separate function? This would have to be a function that would take the resource prop as an argument, and would have to be a function that was going to always return our resources array with either an empty array at initialization or an array with all of our current resources inside of it at some point in the future. Let's try that out. Let's try extracting all of that hook-related logic into a separate function. So inside of my resource list file, at the very top, I'm going to define a new function called useResources. The only input that I'm going to provide to this function is going to be the resource type that we're trying to fetch. So that's going to be a string of either posts or to-dos. I'm then going to take all of my hook-related logic, so everything from useState all the way down to the closing paren of useEffect. I'm going to cut all that, and I'm going to paste it inside of useResources. And then remember, the only thing that our component is trying to use out of all this hook-related stuff is that list of resources right there, that array right there. So at the very end of that function, I'm going to return that list of resources. I'm going to return that array. So now we are essentially in the same scenario we were in before when everything was located inside of a single component. We've got a function that is has an input of our resource, and then it has an output of the resources array. So let's now try calling that function from inside of our resource list component. Inside of here, I'm going to say const resources is use resources, and I'm going to pass in the resource that we are trying to fetch at this point in time. All right, let's save this, and we'll flip back over to the browser and just see what happens. So back over here, I get my refresh, and as you'll notice, I still made my request to posts. I can flip over to-dos, I still got the request to to-dos, and I can click on the to-dos button as many times as I want, but I do not make another follow-up request. So we've got the exact same behavior that we had before. Now this might seem like not a very big improvement by extracting that logic into a separate function, but in fact, it really, really is. Here's why. This function right here has no tie to any specific one component. We can reuse this function anywhere else inside of our project. If we ever have another file that we want to have make a request to JSON placeholder, we can just pass in the route that we want to receive. And then in response, we're going to get back an array, or essentially whatever we get in response from that endpoint. Let's take a pause right here. When we come back in the next section, we're going to try to put together a new component inside of our application, and we're going to use resources right here. And you're going to see how easily we can reuse all this hook stuff inside of another component. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.